Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today, I'll be reviewing Ex Libris. This game was designed by Adam McIver, and it is a worker placement style game that has players competing to build the best library in front of themselves that they can. They're going to do this by visiting a wide variety of worker placement spots that are going to change drastically from one turn to the next. They will also be activating their drastically different asymmetric player powers, all in the goal of building the most well-rounded, stable library that avoids as many banned books as possible and has the most of those premium books that people are really looking for. First, I'll explain how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. At its core, Ex Libris is a tableau building game, and you'll be doing set collection, trying to acquire the correct cards to put down into your tableau. And before I talk about the main mechanics of the game, I want to show you how to actually build this library that's going to win you the game. Now, at the beginning of the game, you start with 6 cards in your hand, and you'll see the letter, which is the starting letter for every one of the books that is on this card. They all have fun, punny names like Yes, We Can Trip, and Yetis and Their Love of Spaghetti, but also along the top of the card, we see icons which tell you what type of each book is. So in this case, this is Spells and Potions, and this one over here is a Monster's Manual. Whenever the game tells you that you can shelve a card, that means you're going to take the card either from your hand or from a location, and you put it down in front of you. If it's the first card, it can go anywhere, but any future shelved cards need to go next to, in an orthogonal way, one of your previously placed cards, and you are never allowed to have a library that is more than 3 tall. Now, as you're putting these down, there is another very important restriction, and that is that you will only score cards that are in alphabetical order at the end of the game, and this is where these numbers come into play. If we look right over here, we see that on the T we have 2 out of 10 and 5 out of 10. That means that there are 10 cards in the game that start with T, and this one with a 2 out of 10 is actually going to be before the 5 out of 10 card. So once we pull up the central player board, we can now see the variety of ways in which our library will actually score us points. Now right here we see alphabetical order is first, so this means at the end of the game we are all going to check to make sure we have actually built out an alphabetical library in front of us. So if we were to have these T's down here and the 5 was in front of the 2, then at the end of the game you would actually be forced to flip this one over, leaving that spot in your shelf but not scoring those options on the card. So next up, let's go ahead and build our library like this, and let's shift this over to see the next scoring thing for our library, and that is going to be shelf stability. We're going to find the largest rectangle of cards that is at least 2 by 2 large and is associated with the bottom level, and we're going to get 1 point for each. This means right now our shelf stability gives us 0 points, but if we had this S right here, we would now get 4 points for these 4 cards. It also means if we had something that was oriented a bit more like this, we would get 0 points because we have an unstable shelf with this gap right here on the bottom. In addition to shelf stability, all the libraries are also going to be judged on their prominent works. And at the beginning of the game, we are going to shuffle up all of these cards. One of each are associated with the different types of books, and one of these is going to be a prominent work. So in this case, when the game is over, the player who has the most of these reference text cards in their area, and as you can see right now, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so we're in a pretty good spot, then the leading player is going to get 15 points, and then 9 and 4 points for the players who have less. But as you play, you also have to make sure to avoid as many banned books as possible. This is also going to be randomly selected at the beginning of the game, and that means that the player will lose 1 point for every one of these spells and potions books in this particular play. So looking out here, they are currently losing 1 point, but oftentimes it actually makes sense to maybe have this card down because it's going to do better for winning you lots of points, and you only lose 1 point for the banned spells. The second to last way that your library is going to be judged is categorical variety. And in this case, you're actually trying to have the most balanced library possible as far as all of the different types of books, not including the banned books. So you're going to look out and find the type that you have the least of. And if we look out here, we have, let's see, 2 of the black books. We have 2 of the red books. There are 2 green books. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the blue books, but only 1 yellow book, which means right now our categorical variety is only scoring on yellow because that's the least, and we get 3 points for that. So that would be 3 times 1, or just 3 points, which goes to show that it's very important to try and bolster up and have an even amount of all of these different types of books. The final way that your library is going to get judged is the library focus, and all of the type cards that were not used for prominent works or banned are going to be given out to each of the players as a hidden goal throughout the game. And when the game is over, each player will reveal their goal, and then they will score 2 points for every book of that chosen type. So again, in this case, that's probably not too great for us, just 2 points, but now you should have a good idea of how you're actually going to want to build your library, and let's now take a look and see how the worker placement phase works to actually grab these cards and build it out. At the start of the game, players need to decide if they are going to be playing fully symmetric characters or if they're going to go with asymmetries. And if they do the asymmetries, you will draw out twice as many of these as there are players, and they will draft them in reverse player order. When they do this, they will take two pawns of their color and then the one pawn that is associated with their specific character, and the rest of these won't be used in that game. At the beginning of every round, we have to deal out one worker placement location for each of the players, and in the first turn of the game, you always have to have the Diviner's Hut down. So in this case, we would draw two more cards from the stack, and you'll see this number in the top corner. We're going to go ahead and put them in order according to that, and we now have all of the worker placement locations available to us for this first turn of the game. When you look closer at some of these worker placement spots, you'll see a section that has a deal number. And that means we actually deal this number of cards face up on top of that section, and those worker placement actions are likely going to interact with those specific cards that are over there. Play always starts with the start player as denoted by this token right here, and on your turn you simply take one of your workers, which could be a generic one or your special one, and you will activate one spot that has one of these worker placement locations on it, including the three that are on your own player board that only you can activate. Now, when you actually put the pawn down, it's going to depend on what happens based on the location. For instance, you see this little lightning bolt here, and then this little clock there. When you go to a lightning bolt spot like this, you get to evaluate it immediately. And in this case, the bookseller just lets you take one of the cards that is currently on top of this location, and you pull it into your hand, or you can immediately shelve it, putting it out onto the table. Versus we have the auction house. If we were to go right here, then we would actually be bidding at the end of the round. This clock means it happens once everybody's placed everything, to discard 3 cards in order to take all 3 of these cards and put those into our hand, or to immediately shelve them out there. But there are special rules for many of these locations. For instance, if I went here, then one of my opponents could take their pawn and go to the 4, and specifically for the auction house, that would kick this one out, and now they have a better bid. But other locations, like the bookseller, multiple people can live on that spot in harmony. But this is where some of the asymmetries come in, because if, for instance, this player over here had put their snowman, the special ability for this is that no other players can activate any slots on that location. So this would be a very powerful one to put down here in order to win the auction for not that much using their ability. Another option would be this gelatinous cube. When you put that down, whenever anybody else goes to that spot, they either have to give you a donated card or allow you to do a bonus action. So in this way, you could see the asymmetries can really come into play. The last one I really want to talk about is the Diviner's Hut, because it is in every single game. And if you look at the specifics on the card, it says you draw 1 card for every assistant that you have placed, and then you take the first player token. This is the only way that the first player token moves, and it means that in the first round, if you were to go onto the spot, you would just draw 1 card, but if you were to wait a couple rounds and you have a couple of your workers out already, and then go there, you would be able to draw several of these cards, and then take the starting player token for yourself for the next round. When we look closer at some of these locations, you'll see a 3+ and 4+ on some of these slots. This has to do with player count. That means in this 3-player game, only 3 of these workers would be able to go there, and this last one would be blocked out and only usable in a 4-player game. The last thing to cover as far as worker placement locations go are these home actions. They are the same for every single player board. There is no asymmetry here, and whenever you put a worker onto one of these spots, you simply get to draw a card or shelve 1 card. So they are relatively weak actions, but they are always available to you. Once every player has put all of their workers down, the round is over, and we're going to go ahead and activate and clear all of the worker placement spots. So if they had a lightning bolt, then all that happens is you clear the token back. But if it has the clock, then this would be the moment when you actually do that spot. So in this case, the player over here would have to discard 1 card for winning the auction, and then they would gather all 3 of these and potentially shelve them right away. Once they have all been evaluated, we now get to take a look and see the numbers. We have 1, 3, and 10. And we always take the lowest value location, and we then put it up onto this player board. We discard all these remaining ones, and then we go to this gigantic stack of other locations. We draw an equal number to the number of players. We put these out in order, so we have 6, 13, and 18, and then we play the next round, and we, of course, seed these locations. So as you can see, as the game goes on, you're going to have more and more worker placement locations. Once this round is over, these 6 would actually come up here. You would discard these 2 and draw 3 more. So there are going to be more and more spots to choose from. The game will keep playing in this way, round after round, gaining more and more worker placement spots until a round ends where a player has 16, 14, or 12 cards in front of them shelved in their library based on the player count. Once that happens, the game is over and we can go into endgame scoring. The game comes with the official library inspection form B7C as well as a dry erase pen, and this is just a good way for us to write everything down that we did to figure out our final scores. Now we go ahead and put our name up at the top, and before we check for our alphabetization of our library, we can optionally flip over any books we want to. And now we're just going to go ahead and fill everything in, including all of the numbers of these different types of books. And this is going to help us figure out our categorical bonus to see which one we have the fewest of. It also tells us if we won the majority for the prominent books, and we can also log things like our shelf stability and our private personal goal as well. Once we sum up those scores, we figure out who has the most points, and that person is going to be the winner. Let's now begin the review for Ex Libris by starting with a few positive points, and the first of these has to do with the shelving puzzle that this game gives you. Realistically, this is what the game is all about. It's the library you're trying to build in front of you, and there are several different things you are thinking about while you're trying to put these cards down. If it was just put these cards in alphabetical order, that would obviously not be very interesting, but instead the game presents you with some pretty interesting decisions of when do you actually commit to put these books down in front of you, and also when is it good enough to stop hoping to find that next perfect book that's going to fit right alongside that one set of books that you already have. Like, you will have moments of good luck where you'll pull the perfect card that matches up just well, but more often than not, you're going to be sitting there and you're like, well, do I jump from R to W or something like that? Or even bigger ones, where like from I all the way to Q. And you might be looking at your hand and you're like, that's actually probably what I'm going to do, because at the end of the day, the game is going to end once somebody has at least 12, 14, or 16 cards in their tableau based on the player size. But with 26 letters in the alphabet, that means that you are obviously going to be avoiding a lot of these letters in the alphabet. So you really just need to try and make these decisions of when you are going to say, enough is enough, I'm just going to put these two cards down together, even though there's like 30 or 40 cards in between the two that I could end up grabbing that could be really good to me, because the game clock is going. Like, you need to know the right moment to just start putting shelves down, putting books down into your shelves, because if somebody else gets reasonably far ahead of you in actually getting these books down, you might not be able to race back and catch up to where they are. You definitely have to be present, looking at the table and seeing where everybody else is, because at a certain moment, it feels like there is a sprint of people just now throwing books down like crazy, and you want to make sure you're not behind. So all of those great decisions come together to try to figure out, when do I go and when do I just sit here and try to build up a bigger hand of cards, because there is no hand limit in this game. Realistically, you could just keep drawing cards like crazy, but at a certain point, that is going to do you wrong, because you get no points for the cards you have in your hand at the end. It's just the cards that are shelved in your library. For positive number 2, I want to talk about the interesting tweak this game brings to the worker placement genre. In this game, you will be randomly dealing out a number of worker placement locations equal to the number of players every single turn, and you'll be discarding all of those but one every single turn as well. So that means that from one turn to the next, you're going to have a significant difference in the variety of options that you have available to you to actually grab these cards and put them down in front of you. But I also love that idea that you grab the lowest value worker placement spot and bring it up to the top as a permanent location, because not only do you have a sense of escalation as the game goes on, you start with very few worker placement spots and you end with a whole bunch of them, but it also means that one game is going to play pretty differently from the next based off of the shuffle of those tiles, because you will oftentimes have the low values like 1, 2, and 3 end up being permanent locations, because they are more often than not the lowest version of the locations that come out on a turn. But every now and then you'll have a situation where it's like 12, 15, 17, and that means the 12 is now going to be a permanent spot, and odds are relatively high that you haven't played a game with the 12 as a permanent spot before. So that means that in one game you might have a pool drafting session every single turn for the rest of the game based off of how those tiles came out, and in another game you have people gambling like crazy turn after turn. In that third game, you have an auction that keeps going every single round. It's really cool to have these things come and go in brief stints, but it's also cool to see the variance of having a variety of different ones lock up to the top from one game to the next. Now, I will admit that based on the player count, you can have some kind of weird slow starts because of this. Specifically at the 2-player count, you start with the Diviner's Hut, which just allows you to pass the first player token around, and you draw one more. And in the 2-player game I played, we had the Diviner's Hut and then the garbage dump come out, which meant that you could dig through the discard pile that was currently non-existent. So in that first full round of the game, one person did the Diviner's Hut, and then we pretty much just did our little home actions and then went to the next round. And it seemed like it's definitely possible in the first couple rounds of the game for it to feel slow and for that to not feel like there is a huge variety of worker placement spots. I feel like maybe you should have drawn +1 to the player count or something like that. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but Once you get to the later stages of the game, it really opens up and you have tons of options. But based on the shuffle of those locations, it is possible to have kind of a weird slow start. It doesn't slow the game down, but it might be slow as far as the number of interesting actions available to you because you just pulled out a tile that's not particularly good for you at the beginning of the game. For positive number 3, let's discuss the asymmetric characters you can play in the game. Now, I was expecting them to add a nice bit of variety to the game, and in general, I really enjoy asymmetry in board games in general. But I was not expecting them to be as different from each other as they actually are. You have a big variety of actions. You have a flame imp, for instance, that can go into places and burn up all of the books on those spots so that nobody else has access to them, and then they get some bonuses for that. You have a mummy who can actually entomb cards underneath previously shelved cards so that they can, and they get a couple points for doing that. You have a character that can actually pull cards off of the board as they get discarded and pull them into your hand. There's just this wide variety of different strong actions that you can do, and based off of which character you choose, you're going to be playing a different game each time you sit down because there's going to be different pacings to how they all work. Like, some of them will just naturally have a much bigger hand of cards, so you're going to be more oriented towards trying to get your shelving going faster, whereas others, like the mummy, for instance, is going to have a harder time having a big shelf at the end of the game, but they're going to get a bunch of bonus points for having entombed all these cards underneath. Now, there's an obvious thing that comes up when you have asymmetries, especially strong asymmetries in games, and that is, do they feel balanced at the end of the day? And this is a tricky thing to answer. I have not played the game enough times to have an authoritative stance on this. I haven't seen every single one of them played just yet, but it does seem like the scores at the end of the games have been relatively tight, and I have a hard time feeling that they are totally balanced just because there are 12 of them and they do such a wide variety of things. I do think some of them feel like they are more flexible in a larger set of circumstances, whereas others are only good in a finite set of circumstances, and the theme of them is fun, and I like the variety, but I do feel like some of them are just a little bit more fun to play than others, but that is probably going to vary on people's personal preferences for how they like to play games. For instance, if you don't like being really interactive, maybe you don't take the Fire Imp, so you're not blowing things up, and maybe if you like having control, you try to draft an asymmetric character that lets you draw a bunch of cards, for instance. For positive number 4, I just want to briefly talk about the great theming of this game and specifically how it integrates over to the mechanics in the game. You have wonderful art all over the place, and it really feels like you are building a library in front of you from a mechanical and thematic perspective because you're putting all of these cards full of books down in front of you, and the books have hilarious names. Every single time we've played, we are constantly quoting the various names of books that we're seeing on them. They're great puns, and it's just really great to see that stuff down in front of you, but then you also have the actual worker placement spots you go to. They feel like what they're supposed to be. If it's a community center, then you're going to take a card and then donate a card to somebody else. If it's a mystery shack, then you are going to be guessing a card and then digging in there to see if you found the right stuff. If it's a gambling den, you are going to be doing gambling between you and your opponents, and it's just all this great mechanical thematic integration going on. There's even a draft house, like a brewery, but then you do a pool draft in the middle of the table. You also have this with the asymmetric player powers. If you're a flame imp, it makes sense that you're going to burn up all these books, and if you are a mummy, it makes sense that you're going to be entombing all these cards down below. I love the theme in general, and I love how it actually plays over to the mechanics as you're playing the game. It feels like a great integration to me. It's now time to move over into a few neutral points, and the first of these has to do with symbol management. Now, there are 6 different types of books, and as you are playing these books down into your shelf, you are going to need to keep track of the amount of symbols you have. Not only how many do you have of the prominent works so that you can make sure to try and be in contention to have the most of those at the end of the game, but more importantly, you need to have a well-rounded bookshelf because you're going to score 3 points for every book you have of the least of all the books you have. So you're constantly trying to figure out how many books you have in the 5 non-banned categories, and that could be a bit tedious, especially near the end of the game when you might have 10 plus cards out in front of you. You will oftentimes be sitting there being like, okay, how many greens do I have? How many yellows do I have? How many reds do I have? Okay, I need green. And then you get maybe a green, and the next turn you're like, wait, which one was I low on? Okay, how many greens do I have? How many yellows do I have? How many reds? And then you go through all of them. Okay, now I need reds. And this is important because you can get a lot of points for making sure you have a balanced library, but it could be just a little bit of a headache. It's not only just looking at the different books you have in front of you, but also then looking out to your opponents and trying to count over and over again how many books they have of the prominent works. I almost wish there was some sort of tracker in the game that you could just have this be public knowledge, because you are oftentimes looking over and you're like, 1, 2, 3, you're kind of like, okay, they have 13. maybe I missed one. I'm going to recount. And that can definitely eat up a little bit of time, which is not the end of the world. It doesn't take up a humongous amount of time, but it can be a bit annoying. And it is important to do this. And this is why it is a neutral point, because it's not the worst thing in the world. And I like the mechanics that come from this kind of tedious task that you need to do. I enjoy the act of actually trying to balance all these books out. I think mechanically that is quite interesting. So I deal with it, but it is a bit frustrating. For neutral number two, let's talk about the role of luck in this game. Now, there is a massive 152 card deck of books that you're going to be dealing from in a wide variety of ways throughout the game. Now, most of the locations get dealt out face up, and that's fine. That's one way to deal with luck of the draw is, well, you see what the options are and you try to go in there and draft that card or buy the card in one way or another. But there are lots of times where you are doing blind draws. For instance, with your home actions, you just draw a card from the top. There are also many locations that have you doing something that can have quite a bit of luck variance. Like with the gambling den, you go there and then you just say, okay, I call blue, and then you draw these four cards, and maybe your opponent calls yellow, and they might have just been lucky that they happen to draw more yellow than blue, and then they get stuff and you didn't get anything for that turn. Or there are other cards where you just are mining deep into that deck. You maybe draw 3 or 4 cards and they may or may not work for you, and luck of the draw is going to become present in all of these situations. You have the mysterious attic or shed or something like that that has face down cards, and you have to call a specific color and you get all the cards of that color, but you could just whiff entirely. And so all of these things are luck based, and this is a game that you just need to go into it understanding that. Like, you might get frustrated if you seem to have a run of bad luck, and that can happen. But you will also have great moments of pulling the perfect card from the top of the deck. And I think in general, they outweigh each other, or they balance out. So that I don't think that luck of the draw is necessarily a problem, especially considering how many of the locations draw cards face up into the middle, so that you have some control over when you're going to grab those cards based off of the player order. But it's definitely something to know that this is a tactical game where you are constantly dealing with how luck happens to you and trying to do the best you can, versus having long-term strategic tendrils going all over the place. You need to be quite quick-footed, jumping around and dealing with the good luck that comes your way as well as the bad luck, because both are going to happen to you. For neutral number three, let's now discuss the role of player order in this game. And it is no surprise that this is a worker placement game, which means that going earlier in player order is a good thing, because you get first dibs at those worker placement spots. But the tweak that this game has on that general feeling is that there is variance in how important it is to go first from one round to the next, and you're not going to know until the next round when you deal out those new worker placement spots, because you will have situations where you might be going fourth and you're like, you know what, as my first action, I'm going to go to that diviner's hut, I'm going to take the start player token, just going to draw one card, which is unfortunate, but I'll be start player for the next round. And you get to the next round and you deal out the locations, and you're like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like, based off of what came out, it might not be that important to actually go first. But you could have other situations where you decide to actually hedge your bets, well, not hedge your bets, I guess, and just risk it and do other things with your actions and not take start player, and then the perfect locations come out. And that is just one more variance that comes to the game. It's one more luck of the draw that you really can't account for, and you just have to go into the game understanding that you're going to have situations like this. And I've seen people get a little bit frustrated with it. It has not been a big deal, and I don't think there's necessarily a flaw with the way that player order works in this game, but it's just one more luck of the draw thing to keep in mind. And I do, as one last thing, want to mention that I do think the Diviner's Hut is an interesting idea, because when you go to that spot, you take cards get to draw cards from the top of the deck equal to the number of assistants that you have already placed, which means it's an incentivized location. Like, in the early part of the round, you're less likely to want to go there, because the longer you wait, the more cards you get to draw from the top of the deck. But the longer you wait, the more likely it is for somebody else to jump in on that spot. But the thing is that I found it's more often than not better for you to actually just go there as your first action if you are in the very end of the player order, because, well, if you wait for that second round, well, the start player, they've also already placed down a worker, so they have become incentivized to go there before you, and they're going to get to draw 2 cards in that moment. They kind of still have first dibs, so, like, I like the idea, the way it becomes a growing incentive, but I think it does not actually help out people on the lower ends of the player order as I at first thought. But anyway, that's pretty much everything I have to say about that. It's not a problem with the game. It's just a little bit of a rough point that has come up a couple times. We've now reached the negative point section, and I only have one to cover, but it's pretty important to the overall gameplay experience, and that is a form over function issue with this game. Specifically, it seems like they have prioritized the beautiful art and theming of the game slightly too much, and it starts to impede on the actual play of the game in two primary ways. The first has to do with the hand of cards that you have in front of you. These are going to be all of the book cards, and they have the letter that they're supposed to be in the top left, which is fine. It shows you the number it is within that letter, which is also fine. The issue is the icons for the different types of books. Now, I understand why those icons are along the top of the book from a thematic perspective, because they kind of line up with the books that are graphically underneath them, and the books are hilarious, and I really like the way all those look out on the table. But what this means is when you try to hold a hand of these cards, it can be kind of frustrating to figure out not only what symbols you have, but also how they match up to the various letters. You almost need to stack them vertically in your hand, which is very odd to do. We've been using card holders at home, and I kind of lay them at a diagonal so I can see all of them and see all the relevant information. I feel like they should have put these icons on the left-hand side of the card as well, or just done that instead. And I know that that wouldn't look as good because they would not directly correlate to the books that they are out on the card, but it'd be so much easier to just hold this hand of cards and see exactly all the information you need to have. It's just an issue with that important information being obscured by the way most people hold cards. So the other issue I have has to do with the worker placement locations. They have beautiful artwork on them, but they also have the text for the location and a very tiny font that is written on top of the art itself, which means it's very busy, it's hard to read, it's almost impossible to read it upside down, I've found, which happens oftentimes when you're playing games, everybody's sitting around a table. And this means that it's just difficult. Also, there is a lot of text on some of these because they're complicated actions, and you oftentimes need to look back to the rulebook and make sure that you're not missing a key interaction that was omitted from the actual card itself. And I feel like the design of these locations should have been half of the location is beautiful art, and the other half is everything you need to know to actually evaluate that spot in larger text that would be, I mean, even if the text was the same size, it'd be way easier to read if it was on a constant, steady background in the back as opposed to being on top of all this beautiful artwork. So both of these have definitely impeded the overall gameplay experience. It has not derailed the overall game, but I do think that they could have been done a lot better. Let's now discuss the variability for Ex Libris, and I think it is definitely more than I expected for a worker placement game of this weight. This comes from two main spots. The first is the asymmetric player abilities you can draft at the beginning of the game. There are 12 of them to choose from, which is a large variety right there. Also, they play pretty differently from one another based off of how you are, the pacing of your putting books into your shelves, as well as how you're going to be interacting with the worker placement spots in the middle of the board. But the other thing has to do with that really interesting worker placement location shuffling mechanic. The fact that you have random ones come out at the beginning of every single turn is going to keep the game fresh from one turn to the next, but also from one game to the next. The way that you're actually going to pull up the permanent ones is going to be different based off of the shuffle of the location cards, and I think both of these come together to be a really great amount of variability in this game. Ex Libris plays 2 to 4 players, and I've played all of those player counts, and I'm happy to say that I think it's good at all of them, but I do think the game is better with more players around the table, which means that 4-player is best and 2-player is probably worst, although I did enjoy my 2-player game. The reason for this is twofold. The first has to do with the number of work placement spots that come out in the beginning of the game. The less people you have, the more likely it is you have weird starts where you can't actually really use the cards that come out. In a 2-player game, you always will, in all player counts, you start with a Diviner set, but in a 2-player game, you're going to draw just one more location, and it might have no impact on the game at that moment. It might interact with the cards you have shelved already, but you haven't shelved anything, or it might let you dig through the discard, but you don't have a discard pile yet, which means for that first turn, one person's probably going to go to the Diviner hut, and then every other action is just plunked down onto your home actions. And these turns go quickly because, well, in the beginning of the game, these home actions are probably going to be you just drawing cards from the top of the deck to try and fill out and see how you're actually going to be shelving stuff. But from an interesting decision perspective, that can be kind of low for those first couple turns. Now, this is not going to happen every time. It's just going to be luck of the draw. And the more players you have around the table, the more likely, or the more action spaces you're going to have, and the more likely you are going to have interesting spots to go to right from the beginning of the game. The other thing is that the game ends when you have 16 cards in your bookshelf at the end of the game with a 2-player game, and only 12 cards for a 4-player game. And as I mentioned in the neutral points, this game can be a bit of a headache with managing all those symbols. So in a 2-player game, that is a much bigger tableau of cards and symbols that you're managing and counting and recounting to make sure that you are balancing everything correctly. I think ending the game where somebody has 12 or more cards is better because you just have less to kind of shuffle around in your head. And of course, this does mean that you are counting out the prominent works for 3 different opponents as opposed to 2 or 1 opponent. But yeah, in the end, I like the way it felt best at 4, but I enjoyed all 3 of those player counts. In conclusion, I've played Ex Libris 3 times at this point, and I've enjoyed all 3 of those plays. The game has exceeded my expectations because when I went into this game after reading the rules, I was expecting it to be okay. I was a little worried about the fiddliness of trying to deal with all of those different symbols, and that did end up being a little bit of a headache that I mentioned before. But what I wasn't expecting was the great thematic integration of the mechanics to what you're actually doing on the table. Also, just the fun of the art and the style and all the different puns on the books, and also the asymmetric player powers making the game feel pretty different from one game to the next. All of these things really seem to work well together, despite the fact that I have some graphical design issues with not only how to actually hold these cards to see the relevant information, but also to actually read out the specifics of what the locations do in the middle of the table. I think those could have been done better, but what I actually have is a game where I enjoy the decisions in it. I like trying to figure out the moment to actually start putting these books down into my shelf. I like the puzzle of figuring out how I'm going to actually do that. Am I going to go for a long and skinny, just 2-row shelf, or am I going to go nice and tall with 3 different rows? And what point in the alphabet am I going to commit to putting this one here or this one there to grow the different things out in different directions? I like all of these decisions in many tableau building style games. Like you have Arboretum, where you are placing all of these trees down into various patterns, trying to score. That one also has a feeling of when do I commit to actually putting the cards down, and I like that feeling here as well. I also like, well, it almost has like a Celtus feel, like this kind of game where you have to decide when is a gap between cards too big to actually play with. You look at this D card, and then you look at this P card, and you're like, am I really going to put them next to each other? I might, because of the other cards I have in my hand. I have a whole bunch of W's and X's, and maybe this is just a game where I'm going to go really low, and I like those decisions of trying to figure out how big to jump versus trying to dig and wait out to find the right cards that fill in those gaps, because at the end of the game, you're probably going to only have between 12 and 17 cards or so in your tableau based off of the player count. I also really like the wide variety of worker placement spots that are in this game. There are 18 different locations, and they do everything I've pretty much ever seen in worker placement games do. My wife Jessica brought up that it had a Fabled Fruit vibe to it because this is a game of set collection with a bunch of wacky worker placement spots that, one creates a pool draft situation, and another one lets you put cards in the middle of the table for people to buy them from you, but then you get to draw cards. Like, there are definitely some similarities there, but I think that is probably because Fabled Fruit as well as Ex Libris are games that are playing off of other worker placement games and looking to for inspiration from a wide variety of other worker placement games, because these are both the type of game where you just put all these actions into a stack and then you reveal them at certain times. I guess in Fabled Fruit, there's a specific order, but in Ex Libris, you're going to be randomizing it and putting them out in the middle of the table, and I love the variety of different spots. And I know that this is not going to be great for everyone. In fact, one person in particular I played with felt like it was a bit too much having the worker placement spots change that drastically from one round to the next, and so I think this is going to be personal preference. My preference is I enjoy that variety. I think it's neat seeing what the new ones are going to be and seeing those other ones go away, and you know that when you discard those locations, you're not going to be getting back to those cards. Like, I've played one game where we went through every single location in the deck. Usually we almost went through the whole deck. We've never recycled those locations and put them back out there. So the ones that go away, they're one and done locations for this game, and I think that's just a neat idea. So at the end of the day, I recommend this game. I think it is a fun time. I think the pacing is good. Most of the games have played around an hour, which is maybe a little bit faster than I expected. And I just like all the decisions I'm doing, even though I am a little bit annoyed at some of the graphical design decisions. So yeah, I recommend Ex Libris. You should definitely give this one a shot if any of this multitude of great things in the game appeal to you. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting my channel through Patreon, including all of these producer-level pledges. If you too would like to support the channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.